The year is 1961. An aging man sits in his stone tower overlooking Lake Zurich, carving figures into the walls with his own hands. For decades, the world has known him as one of the most revolutionary thinkers of the modern age, a man who dared to map the darkest corners of the human psyche, who challenged everything we thought we knew about the mind, about dreams, about the very nature of what it means to be human. But tonight, as Carl Gustav Jung works in the lamplight, chiseling symbols that seem to emerge from some ancient memory, he is haunted by a question that has consumed his entire life. What lies beneath the surface of consciousness? What forces shape our deepest thoughts, our most vivid dreams, our strangest behaviours? And perhaps most troubling of all, what happens when you spend a lifetime staring into the abyss of the human soul? This is the story of a man who began his career as a loyal disciple of Freud and ended it as psychology's greatest heretic. A journey that would take him from the sterile halls of Swiss psychiatric hospitals to the mystical traditions of ancient alchemy. From the drawing rooms of Vienna's intellectual elite to the tribal rituals of East Africa. It is the tale of someone who refused to accept easy answers about human nature and paid the price in madness, isolation, and a descent into his own psychological underworld. Before we dive into this extraordinary life, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us continue bringing these deep explorations of history's most fascinating figures to life. I'm always curious to know where in the world you're watching from, so drop a comment below and let me know what draws you to Jung's story. Now settle in as we journey into the mind of the man who gave us concepts that have become part of our everyday language: introvert and extrovert, the collective unconscious, archetypes, synchronicity. These ideas didn't emerge from academic theorizing alone. They were forged in the crucible of one man's relentless quest to understand the deepest mysteries of human experience. Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in a small Swiss village called Keswell, nestled along the shores of Lake Constance. But to understand the man he would become, we must first understand the world into which he was born. This was not just any family. This was a lineage steeped in the supernatural, the mystical, and the unexplained. His grandfather, also named Carl Gustav Jung, had been a prominent physician and a man of considerable local fame. But it was the stories whispered about him that would captivate young Carl's imagination. The elder Jung was said to possess an uncanny ability to communicate with spirits. Locals claimed he held regular conversations with the ghost of Goethe, the great German poet and philosopher. Whether these tales were true or merely village folklore mattered little. They planted seeds in fertile ground. Carl's father, Paul Achilles Jung, served as a rural pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, a quiet, scholarly man who struggled with his own faith even as he preached to others. Paul Jung was learned and well-meaning, but there was a melancholy about him, a sense that he was going through the motions of belief rather than truly living it. His sermons were dutiful rather than inspired, and young Carl would later describe feeling profoundly disappointed by his father's lukewarm spirituality. It was Carl's mother Emily who brought the truly unsettling element into the household. Emily Jung, born Emilie Preiswerk, came from a family with a reputation that both fascinated and terrified the local community. The Preiswerks were known throughout the region as seers, mediums, and psychics. They claimed to possess second sight, to communicate with the dead, to experience visions of events yet to come. Emily herself was deeply troubled, prone to what the family euphemistically called nervous conditions. She would spend days locked in her room, claiming to see spirits and ghosts that tormented her. At night, young Carl would lie awake listening to his mother's strange conversations with invisible presences, Sometimes she would speak in different voices as if other personalities were inhabiting her body. Other times she would predict future events with disturbing accuracy. The house itself seemed to pulse with supernatural energy. Objects would move without explanation. Strange sounds echoed through the rooms at night. Doors would slam shut on their own. Carl's earliest memories were filled with an atmosphere of dread and wonder, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed paper-thin. This was the psychological landscape that shaped Jung's earliest years. A father who doubted the very faith he professed. A mother who seemed to exist as much in the spirit world as in the physical one. And a young boy caught between these two poles, trying to make sense of a reality that seemed far stranger and more mysterious than what other children experienced. The impact on Carl was profound and immediate. By the age of 3, he was already displaying signs of the psychological complexity that would define his entire life. He was a solitary child, given to long periods of intense introspection. While other children played games, Carl would sit for hours, absorbed in his own inner world, constructing elaborate fantasies and wrestling with questions that seemed far too sophisticated for his age. He began experiencing what he would later call number ones and number twos. Number one was his ordinary, everyday personality, the child who went to school and interacted with others. But number two was something else entirely, an ancient, timeless presence that seemed to possess wisdom and knowledge far beyond his years. When number two emerged, Carl felt as if he was channeling the thoughts and feelings of someone who had lived for centuries. These early experiences of what psychologists might today recognize as dissociation or multiple personality states were not frightening to young Carl. Instead, they felt natural, even comforting. It was as if he possessed access to layers of consciousness that others could not reach. He would later describe feeling like he was simultaneously a child and an ancient sage, existing in multiple time periods at once. School provided no refuge from this psychological complexity. Carl was intellectually gifted, but socially awkward. He struggled to relate to his classmates, who seemed to live in a simpler, more straightforward reality. While they concerned themselves with typical childhood pursuits, Carl was grappling with profound questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of death, and the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. His academic performance was erratic. In subjects that captured his imagination, he excelled brilliantly, but in areas that seemed mundane or disconnected from his deeper interests, he would simply disengage. Teachers found him puzzling, clearly intelligent, but also strangely distant, as if he were observing their lessons from some remote psychological vantage point. It was during these school years that Carl began to develop what would become his lifelong fascination with symbols and their hidden meanings. He would spend hours studying the patterns in stones, the shapes of clouds, the way shadows fell across walls. Each seemed to contain messages, secret communications from some deeper layer of reality. He began keeping detailed records of his dreams, which were unusually vivid and often seemed prophetic. One dream in particular would haunt him for the rest of his life. He found himself in a vast underground chamber, filled with ancient artifacts and mysterious symbols. At the center stood a massive stone throne, and upon it sat a figure that seemed both terrifying and magnificent. The being spoke to him in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood completely. It told him that he had been chosen for a special purpose, that his life would be dedicated to uncovering the hidden truths that lay buried in the human psyche. Carl woke from this dream with a sense of destiny that never left him. Even as a child, he understood that his path would be different from others. He was being called to explore territories of human experience that most people preferred to avoid or deny altogether. His relationship with conventional religion became increasingly complicated. The Lutheran services his father conducted seemed hollow and meaningless compared to the rich, mysterious spiritual experiences Carl was having on his own. He began to see organized religion as a pale shadow of the true spiritual forces that governed human existence. This skepticism toward established authority would become a defining characteristic of Jung's personality. Even at a young age, he displayed a fierce independence of thought and a willingness to challenge accepted wisdom when it conflicted with his own direct experience. As Carl entered adolescence, the intensity of his inner life only deepened. He began reading voraciously, drawn particularly to works on philosophy, mythology, and the occult. He devoured the writings of Goethe, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. Each book seemed to provide pieces of a vast puzzle he was trying to solve about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to the cosmos. His teenage years were marked by a growing sense of isolation from his peers and even his family. His mother's mental instability continued to worsen, and she was frequently hospitalized for what doctors called nervous breakdowns. His father retreated further into his books and his increasingly hollow religious duties. Carl found himself essentially raising himself, guided only by his own inner compass and his insatiable curiosity about the mysteries of existence. It was during this period that he began to seriously consider his future. Medicine attracted him because it offered a scientific approach to understanding human suffering, but he was also drawn to philosophy and theology, fields that grappled with the bigger questions that fascinated him. He sensed that his true calling lay somewhere at the intersection of all these disciplines, in some new territory that had yet to be fully explored. Little did he know that this new territory would eventually become the field of analytical psychology, and that his name would become synonymous with some of the most profound insights into human nature ever achieved. But that journey lay ahead. For now, he was simply a strange, brilliant young man, carrying the weight of family secrets and supernatural experiences, preparing to enter a world that had no idea what revolutionary changes he would bring to our understanding of the human mind. The stage was set for one of the most extraordinary intellectual journeys in modern history, a journey that would take Carl Jung from the provincial world of Swiss village life to the forefront of international psychology and ultimately into the deepest mysteries of human consciousness itself. The young man who would revolutionize our understanding of the human psyche stood at a crossroads. As Carl Jung prepared to leave his childhood home and enter university, he carried with him a psychological inheritance unlike any other. The supernatural experiences, the family legacy of mysticism, the profound questions that had consumed his adolescence, all of this would soon collide with the rational scientific world of late 19th century medicine. In 1895, at the age of 20, Jung enrolled at the University of Basel to study medicine. The choice seemed practical enough for a young man from a modest family background. Medicine offered respectability, financial security, and the promise of helping others. But Jung's reasons for choosing this path ran deeper than mere pragmatism. He sensed that somewhere within the study of human illness and healing lay answers to the mysteries that had fascinated him since childhood. The University of Basel was a world away from the supernatural atmosphere of his youth. Here, everything was ordered, rational, methodical. Professors in starched white coats dissected cadavers with clinical precision. Students memorized anatomical structures and chemical formulas. The emphasis was on observable facts, measurable phenomena, empirical evidence. There was no room for ghosts, visions, or mystical experiences. Initially, Jung threw himself into his studies with characteristic intensity. He excelled in anatomy, physiology, and pathology. His professors recognized his intellectual gifts and his capacity for rigorous analysis. But as the months passed, he began to feel a familiar restlessness, the same sense of disconnection he had experienced in childhood when faced with conventional thinking. The problem was not that Jung rejected scientific methodology. On the contrary, he was deeply committed to careful observation and systematic analysis. The issue was that the medicine of his era seemed to view human beings as nothing more than complex biological machines. There was no acknowledgement of the psychological depths he had glimpsed in his own experience, no recognition that consciousness might operate according to principles that transcended simple cause and effect. His fellow students found him increasingly eccentric. While they socialized and pursued typical university pleasures, Jung would disappear for hours into the library, reading works that had nothing to do with their medical curriculum. He devoured texts on philosophy, ancient religions, and folklore. He was particularly drawn to the works of German Romantic philosophers who had grappled with questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the broader cosmos. It was during his university years that Jung first encountered the writings of Arthur Schopenhauer, the pessimistic German philosopher whose work The World as Will and Representation would profoundly influence his thinking. Schopenhauer argued that beneath the surface of rational consciousness lay deeper, irrational forces that drove human behaviour. This idea resonated powerfully with Jung's own observations about the hidden layers of the psyche. But it was Friedrich Nietzsche who truly set Jung's intellectual world ablaze. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead and his exploration of the psychological consequences of living in a world without traditional religious certainties spoke directly to Jung's own struggles with faith and meaning. Nietzsche's concept of the unconscious as a realm of repressed instincts and drives provided a framework for understanding the mysterious forces Jung had sensed operating beneath the surface of human consciousness. As Jung progressed through his medical studies, he became increasingly convinced that conventional medicine was missing something essential about human nature. Doctors could treat broken bones and infected organs, but what about the deeper ailments that seem to afflict the human soul? What about the mysterious connections between mind and body that he had observed in his mother's illness? What about the profound psychological wounds that seemed to underlie so much human suffering? These questions led him to develop a particular interest in psychiatry, a field that was just beginning to emerge as a legitimate medical specialty. In the late 19th century, psychiatry was still viewed with suspicion by the mainstream medical establishment. Mental illness was poorly understood, and psychiatric patients were often warehoused in grim institutions with little hope of recovery. But Jung saw in psychiatry the possibility of bridging the gap between the scientific rigour he had learned to value and the psychological mysteries that had fascinated him since childhood. His professors were puzzled by this choice. Psychiatry was considered a backwater of medicine, a field for physicians who couldn't succeed in more prestigious specialties. Why would a brilliant student like Jung choose to work with the mentally ill? But Jung had glimpsed something that his professors had missed. He understood that mental illness might provide a unique window into the deeper structures of human consciousness, revealing aspects of the psyche that remained hidden in normal, everyday experience. As he prepared for his final examinations, Jung made a discovery that would change the entire trajectory of his life. While browsing in a bookstore, he came across a textbook on psychiatry written by Richard von Krafft-Ebing, one of the leading German psychiatrists of the era. As he read Krafft-Ebing's descriptions of various psychiatric conditions, Jung experienced what he later described as a moment of illumination. Here, finally, was a field that took seriously the strange, irrational aspects of human experience that had shaped his own life. Here was a discipline that recognized that consciousness was far more complex and mysterious than conventional medicine acknowledged. Psychiatry offered the possibility of studying scientifically the same kinds of phenomena that had surrounded him in childhood. The voices, visions, and altered states that had once terrified and fascinated him. In that moment, Jung knew he had found his calling. He would become a psychiatrist, but not the kind who simply medicated symptoms and hoped for the best. He would become a new kind of doctor, one who could navigate both the rational world of scientific medicine and the mysterious realm of the unconscious mind. He would develop methods for understanding and healing the deepest wounds of the human psyche. This decision set him on a collision course with the established psychiatric practices of his time. It would lead him to challenge fundamental assumptions about mental illness, consciousness, and human nature itself. It would bring him into contact with some of the most brilliant and controversial figures of the early 20th century, including a certain Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud, who was developing his own revolutionary theories about the unconscious mind. But all of that lay ahead. For now, Jung was simply a young medical student who had discovered his passion. As he completed his degree and prepared to enter the professional world, he carried with him a unique combination of scientific training and mystical sensitivity that would soon shake the foundations of psychology itself. The transformation from troubled youth to pioneering psychiatrist was about to begin. The young man who had grown up surrounded by spirits and supernatural phenomena was ready to bring his extraordinary psychological gifts to bear on the suffering of others. He had no idea that in trying to heal the minds of his patients, he would ultimately revolutionize our understanding of what it means to be human. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable careers in the history of psychology. A career that would span decades and continents, touching on everything from the treatment of schizophrenia to the interpretation of ancient myths. A career that would establish Jung as one of the towering intellectual figures of the modern age and create a body of work that continues to influence how we think about consciousness, creativity, and the deepest mysteries of human experience. But first he had to survive his encounter with the madness that would both inspire and nearly destroy him in the years to come. In December 1900, Carl Jung walked through the gates of the Burghlzli hospital for the first time as a newly appointed assistant physician. The imposing Victorian structure, perched on a hill overlooking Zurich, represented the pinnacle of progressive psychiatric care in Europe. Here, under the direction of the renowned Eugène Bleuler, a new approach to mental illness was being pioneered, one that viewed patients as human beings, deserving of understanding, rather than mere specimens to be studied or warehoused. But nothing could have prepared the 25-year-old Jung for what awaited him inside those walls. The Burghlzli was home to some of the most severe cases of mental disturbance in Switzerland. Patients suffering from what would later be termed schizophrenia wandered the corridors speaking in tongues that only they could understand. Others sat motionless for hours, trapped in catatonic states that seemed to render them unreachable by conventional means. For most physicians of that era, these patients represented medical failures, broken minds that had moved beyond the reach of rational intervention. But Jung saw something different. In the bizarre utterances and strange behaviours of his patients, he recognised echoes of the supernatural experiences that had shaped his own childhood. These were not simply diseased brains producing meaningless symptoms. These were human beings whose psyches had been overwhelmed by forces from the deepest layers of consciousness. His colleagues initially viewed the young Swiss doctor with mixture of curiosity and concern. Jung spent far more time talking with patients than was considered necessary or appropriate. He would sit for hours listening to their rambling monologues, taking careful notes not just on their symptoms, but on the content of their delusions and hallucinations. While other doctors focused on managing symptoms through cold baths, restraints, and primitive medications, Jung seemed genuinely interested in understanding what his patients were actually experiencing. One case in particular captured his attention and would influence his thinking for decades to come. Babette was a middle-aged woman who had been institutionalized after suffering what appeared to be a complete psychotic break. She spent her days constructing elaborate fantasies about celestial beings and cosmic forces, speaking in what seemed like complete nonsense to the medical staff. But Jung noticed patterns in her seemingly random utterances. Hidden within her chaotic speech were references to ancient mythological figures, alchemical symbols, and religious concepts that she had no conscious knowledge of. How could an uneducated peasant woman produce such sophisticated, symbolic material? Jung began to suspect that Babette's madness was not simply a breakdown of normal mental functioning, but rather an eruption of deeper psychological contents that existed beneath ordinary consciousness. This observation led him to develop what would become one of his most revolutionary insights. Perhaps the human psyche contained layers of memory and knowledge that extended far beyond individual experience. Perhaps there existed a collective dimension of the unconscious that connected all human beings to the accumulated wisdom and imagery of our species. Meanwhile, Jung's reputation as an innovative clinician was growing throughout the psychiatric community. His detailed case studies and careful observations were earning recognition from senior physicians across Europe. But it was his development of the word association test that truly established his credentials as a serious researcher. The test itself was elegantly simple. Jung would read a list of words to patients and measure how long it took them to respond with the first word that came to mind. Delays, unusual responses, or emotional reactions suggested the presence of what he termed complexes, clusters of emotionally charged thoughts and memories that operated independently of conscious control. This technique provided the first scientific method for detecting and studying unconscious mental processes. Using carefully calibrated measurements and statistical analysis, Jung could map the hidden psychological terrain that lay beneath his patient's conscious awareness. The word association test became a standard tool in psychiatric diagnosis and established Jung's reputation as both a clinician and a researcher of the highest caliber. But success at the Burghlzli came with its own challenges. The more deeply Jung delved into the mysteries of the unconscious mind, the more he began to question the fundamental assumptions of contemporary psychiatry. His colleagues were content to classify symptoms and manage behaviors. Jung wanted to understand the meaning behind mental illness, to decode the symbolic language through which the psyche communicated its deepest truths. This quest for meaning led him to expand his reading far beyond medical literature. He immersed himself in mythology, anthropology, and comparative religion, searching for clues about the universal patterns that seemed to emerge in his patients' fantasies and delusions. Ancient myths began to feel less like primitive superstitions and more like maps of psychological territories that modern science was only beginning to discover. It was during this period of intense study and clinical work that Jung first encountered the writings of Sigmund Freud. The Viennese neurologist's groundbreaking work, The Interpretation of Dreams, had been published in 1900, the same year Jung began his career at the Burghlzli. Reading Freud's revolutionary ideas about the unconscious mind and the symbolic nature of dream imagery felt like discovering a kindred spirit, someone else who recognized that the human psyche operated according to principles far more complex and mysterious than conventional medicine acknowledged. Jung began incorporating Freudian concepts into his own clinical work, using dream analysis and free association techniques with his patients. The results were remarkable. Patients who had been considered hopeless cases began showing signs of improvement when their symptoms were approached as meaningful communications from the unconscious rather than mere pathological disturbances. Word of Jung's innovative methods spread throughout the international psychiatric community. By 1906, he had published his first major work, Studies in Word Association, which demonstrated the scientific validity of unconscious mental processes. The book established him as one of the leading figures in the emerging field of psychoanalysis and caught the attention of Freud himself. The stage was set for one of the most significant collaborations in the history of psychology. But neither Jung nor Freud could have anticipated how their partnership would evolve, or how their eventual break would lead Jung into even more revolutionary territory. The young psychiatrist who had begun his career simply trying to understand the strange behaviours of his patients was about to become involved in a movement that would transform our understanding of human nature itself. As Jung prepared to make contact with the famous Viennese doctor whose ideas had so captivated him, he had no idea that their relationship would ultimately force him to confront the deepest questions about consciousness, creativity, and the mysterious forces that shape human destiny. The next phase of his journey would take him far from the familiar confines of the Burghlzli into territories of the mind that few had dared to explore. The young man who had grown up surrounded by supernatural phenomena was about to discover that the greatest mysteries lay not in external spirits or ghostly visitations, but in the vast, largely unexplored continent of the human psyche itself. In February 1907, a letter arrived at the Burghlzli that would change the course of Jung's life forever. The envelope bore the return address of Berggasse 19, Vienna, the home and office of Professor Sigmund Freud. Inside, written in Freud's precise handwriting, was an invitation that read more like a royal summons. The father of psychoanalysis had been following Jung's work with growing interest and wanted to meet this promising young Swiss psychiatrist who seemed to understand the profound implications of unconscious mental processes. Jung's hands trembled slightly as he read the letter. For months he had been corresponding with Freud about various cases and theoretical questions. Their exchange of ideas had been intellectually stimulating, but this was different. This was a direct invitation to enter the inner circle of the psychoanalytic movement, to join the small group of physicians who were revolutionizing our understanding of human consciousness. The journey to Vienna felt like a pilgrimage, as Jung's train wound its way through the Alpine valleys and across the Austrian border. He found himself both excited and apprehensive about the meeting ahead. Freud was already 51 years old, an established figure with an international reputation. Jung was 32, still making his mark in the psychiatric world. What would the great man think of this earnest young Swiss doctor with his unconventional ideas about mythology and symbolism? When Jung finally arrived at Berggasse 19, he was struck by the atmosphere of scholarly intensity that pervaded Freud's study. The walls were lined with ancient artifacts, Egyptian figurines, Greek pottery, Roman sculptures. Books in multiple languages filled every available shelf. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the weight of serious intellectual conversation. Freud himself was smaller in stature than Jung had expected, but his presence filled the room. His dark eyes seemed to penetrate directly to the core of whatever he was examining. His beard was meticulously groomed, his manner both warm and intimidating. When he spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had spent years mapping previously unknown territories of the human mind. Their first conversation lasted 13 hours. 13 uninterrupted hours of intense discussion about the unconscious, about dreams, about the hidden motivations that drive human behaviour. Jung had never encountered anyone who could match his own psychological insights with such intellectual rigour and theoretical sophistication. Freud, for his part, was impressed by the younger man's clinical experience and his intuitive understanding of symbolic processes. But even in those first hours of their relationship, subtle differences began to emerge. Freud's focus was primarily on sexuality as the driving force behind unconscious conflicts. He saw neurotic symptoms as the result of repressed sexual desires, usually dating back to early childhood experiences. This perspective made perfect sense for many of the cases Jung had encountered, but it seemed to miss something essential about the broader spiritual and mythological dimensions he had observed in his patients' fantasies. Jung found himself both fascinated and troubled by Freud's reductive approach. Yes, sexual conflicts clearly played a role in many psychiatric disturbances. But what about the cosmic themes that appeared in psychotic episodes? What about the religious imagery that emerged in dreams? What about the profound philosophical questions that seemed to torture many of his most intelligent patients? Despite these early reservations, Jung threw himself wholeheartedly into the psychoanalytic movement. He became Freud's most prominent supporter outside of Vienna, translating and promoting psychoanalytic ideas throughout the German-speaking world. His position at the Burghlzli gave him access to a wealth of clinical material that helped validate and extend Freudian theory. In 1909, Jung received an invitation that seemed to confirm his rising status within the international psychiatric community. Clark University in Massachusetts had invited both Freud and Jung to deliver lectures on psychoanalysis to American audiences. This would be their first trip to the New World, an opportunity to introduce revolutionary ideas about the unconscious mind to a culture that prized practical results and scientific progress. The ocean voyage to America provided an unexpected window into both men's personalities. Freud was a creature of habit, precise in his routines, somewhat anxious about the unfamiliar environment. Jung was more adaptable, more curious about new experiences. During their long conversations on deck, Jung began to share some of his more speculative ideas about the collective dimensions of the unconscious. He told Freud about patterns he had noticed in his patients' delusions, how certain symbols and themes appeared repeatedly, even in individuals who had no cultural knowledge of their historical significance. He described his growing conviction that the human psyche contained layers of memory that extended far beyond personal experience, connecting each individual to the accumulated wisdom of the entire species. Freud listened with growing concern. Such ideas seemed dangerously close to the mystical thinking that he had worked so hard to eliminate from psychology. The strength of psychoanalysis lay in its scientific rigor, its focus on observable phenomena, its rejection of supernatural explanations for human behavior. Jung's speculations about collective memory and universal symbols threatened to undermine the entire empirical foundation of their movement. Their lectures at Clark University were tremendously successful. American audiences were hungry for new approaches to psychological problems, and both men were received as conquering heroes of modern science. But privately, the tensions between them were growing. Jung's presentations included references to mythology and comparative religion that made Freud increasingly uncomfortable. The breaking point came gradually, then suddenly. Back in Europe, Jung began developing his own theoretical framework that diverged significantly from orthodox psychoanalytic doctrine. He argued that the unconscious was not merely a repository of repressed sexual desires, but rather a creative force that contained the potential for psychological growth and spiritual development. His 1912 publication of Symbols of Transformation marked the definitive break with Freudian theory. In this groundbreaking work, Jung analyzed the fantasies of a young American woman named Miss Miller, demonstrating how her seemingly personal psychological material connected to universal mythological themes. He argued that the unconscious operated according to symbolic rather than purely causal principles, and that psychological healing involved integrating these symbolic contents rather than simply uncovering repressed memories. Freud's response was swift and devastating. He accused Jung of abandoning scientific rigor in favor of mystical speculation. Their correspondence became increasingly acrimonious, with both men feeling betrayed by someone they had once considered their closest intellectual ally. The personal cost of this break was enormous for Jung. He had invested years of his life in the psychoanalytic movement and had built his professional reputation on his association with Freud. Now he found himself cast out from the inner circle, dismissed as a heretic who had lost his way in pseudo-scientific fantasies. But worse than the professional isolation was the psychological crisis that followed. In severing his ties with Freud, Jung had also cut himself off from the theoretical framework that had given meaning to his clinical work. He was left alone with his observations about the depths of the human psyche, forced to develop an entirely new understanding of consciousness without the support of an established intellectual community. What followed was the most dangerous period of Jung's entire life. Having spent years studying the minds of others, he was about to confront the full force of his own unconscious in a way that would either destroy him completely or transform him into something unprecedented in the history of psychology. The stage was set for Jung's descent into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological experimentation that would either validate his theories about the deeper layers of the psyche or prove that he had indeed lost his grip on reality. The man who had dedicated his career to understanding madness was about to discover just how thin the line between sanity and insanity really was. And in crossing that line, he would either find the keys to unlocking the greatest mysteries of human consciousness, or lose himself forever in the very depths he had spent so long trying to map. The next chapter of Jung's story would unfold not in the safety of academic institutions or the controlled environment of psychiatric hospitals, but in the wild, ungoverned territories of his own psyche. It would be a journey unlike anything undertaken by any psychologist before or since, a deliberate descent into madness in service of a deeper understanding of what it truly means to be human. The year 1913 marked the beginning of what Jung would later describe as his most terrifying and transformative period. With his professional bridges burned and his theoretical moorings cut loose, the 48-year-old psychiatrist found himself adrift in psychological waters that no scientific training had prepared him to navigate. He had spent over a decade studying the fractured minds of others. Now he was about to discover what happened when those same fractures opened within his own consciousness. The initial symptoms were subtle but unmistakable. Jung began experiencing what he called a constant stream of fantasies that seemed to emerge from nowhere. These were not the controlled imaginative exercises of his clinical work, but spontaneous eruptions of imagery that felt alien and autonomous. Ancient figures appeared in his mind's eye, speaking in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Vast landscapes unfolded before him, populated by beings that seemed to exist in some parallel dimension of reality. His family noticed the changes first. Emma Jung, his wife of 8 years and mother of their 4 children, watched with growing alarm as her husband withdrew into himself. Carl would sit for hours in his study, staring into space with an expression of intense concentration, as if listening to voices that only he could hear. When she tried to engage him in conversation, he would respond with a distracted politeness that suggested his attention was focused on something far more compelling than domestic concerns. The professional consequences were immediate and severe. Colleagues at the university began to whisper about Jung's strange behaviour. His lectures, once models of scientific precision, became rambling explorations of mythological themes that seemed to have little connection to psychiatry. Students who had once hung on his every word now exchanged worried glances as their professor spoke passionately about ancient gods and primordial symbols. But Jung was beyond caring about professional reputation. Something far more urgent was demanding his attention. The fantasies were becoming more vivid, more insistent. He began to feel as if multiple personalities were attempting to express themselves through his consciousness. Sometimes he experienced himself as an ancient wise man, possessed of knowledge that spanned millennia. Other times he felt like a primitive savage, driven by instincts that civilized society had long forgotten. The turning point came in December 1913, when Jung made a decision that would have seemed like madness to any conventional physician. Instead of fighting these psychological intrusions, he chose to embrace them. He would deliberately descend into the chaos of his own unconscious, using himself as a laboratory for exploring the deepest layers of human consciousness. He began what he called active imagination, a technique that involved consciously engaging with the figures and scenarios that emerged spontaneously in his psyche. Rather than dismissing these experiences as pathological symptoms, he treated them as meaningful communications from previously unknown aspects of himself. He would enter into dialogues with the strange beings that populated his inner world, questioning them about their nature and purpose. The method was dangerous beyond measure. Jung was essentially inducing controlled psychotic episodes, deliberately dismantling the barriers that normally separate conscious awareness from the chaotic contents of the unconscious mind. He had no roadmap for this journey, no established protocols to ensure his safe return to ordinary reality. He was venturing into territories that had destroyed lesser minds, armed with nothing but his clinical experience and an almost reckless determination to understand. One of the first figures to emerge from these sessions was an ancient man whom Jung called Philemon. Philemon appeared as a wise teacher, with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull, claiming to represent thoughts and insights that existed independently of Jung's conscious mind. Through their conversations, Jung began to understand that the psyche contained autonomous complexes that operated according to their own logic and purposes. These dialogues convinced Jung that consciousness was far more fragmented and multiple than psychology had previously recognized. The unified ego that most people experienced as their identity was actually a thin veneer overlaying a vast community of sub-personalities, each with its own agenda and perspective. Mental illness, he began to realize, might not be a breakdown of normal functioning, but rather an eruption of these normally hidden aspects of the self. As the months passed, Jung's explorations grew more systematic and more perilous. He began recording his visions in a series of elaborately illustrated journals that he called the Red Book. Using calligraphy and illuminated manuscript techniques reminiscent of medieval texts, he documented his encounters with figures from what he was beginning to understand as a collective layer of the unconscious shared by all humanity. The images that emerged were unlike anything in his previous experience. He witnessed cosmic dramas involving serpents and gods, participated in ancient rituals that seemed to connect him to humanity's prehistoric past, and received teachings that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. The boundary between inner and outer experience became increasingly fluid. Sometimes Jung would see visions superimposed on the physical world around him, as if multiple dimensions of reality were simultaneously present. His family life deteriorated as Jung became increasingly absorbed in his inner journey. Emma found herself essentially raising their children alone, while her husband pursued what seemed like an elaborate form of psychological suicide. Friends and colleagues began to wonder if the brilliant psychiatrist had finally succumbed to the same madness he had spent his career studying. The professional isolation was complete. Jung's former associates in the psychoanalytic movement watched his descent with a mixture of vindication and horror. Here was proof, they argued, of what happened when scientific rigor was abandoned in favor of mystical speculation. Freud himself reportedly expressed concern that his former protégé had lost his grip on reality entirely. But Jung pressed on, driven by an almost mystical conviction that his personal psychological crisis was somehow connected to the broader spiritual crisis facing Western civilization. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 seemed to confirm his intuition that humanity was in the grip of forces far more primitive and destructive than rational consciousness could comprehend. In his visions, Jung witnessed apocalyptic scenes of blood and destruction that felt prophetic rather than merely symbolic. He began to understand that his own psychological breakdown was a microcosm of a larger cultural breakdown, a collapse of the rational worldview that had dominated European thought since the Enlightenment. The gods and demons that were erupting from his unconscious were the same archetypal forces that were driving nations to tear themselves apart in unprecedented warfare. This realization gave new meaning to his suffering. Jung began to see himself not as a victim of mental illness, but as a kind of shaman or prophet, someone who was experiencing in his individual psyche the collective trauma of an entire civilization. His descent into madness was a necessary sacrifice, a way of mapping psychological territories that others would need to navigate if humanity was to survive its own destructive impulses. The darkest period came in 1916, when Jung experienced what he later described as a complete dissolution of his personality. For several weeks, he felt as if he had ceased to exist as a coherent individual. Instead, he experienced himself as a vessel through which various autonomous forces expressed themselves. Sometimes he was a medieval alchemist, working with mysterious symbols and transformative processes. Other times, he was a primitive tribal leader, conducting rituals that connected him to the Earth's primal energies. During this phase, Jung began automatic writing, producing texts that seemed to come from sources beyond his conscious control. The most significant of these was 7 Sermons to the Dead, a mystical treatise supposedly dictated by an ancient Gnostic teacher named Basilides. The work explored themes of spiritual transformation and the reconciliation of opposing forces within the psyche, concepts that would later become central to Jung's mature psychological theory. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Jung began to emerge from the depths of his psychological crisis. The visions became less overwhelming, more integrated into his daily consciousness. The various figures that had populated his inner world began to settle into recognizable patterns and relationships. Most importantly, he began to develop a theoretical framework that could make sense of his extraordinary experiences. What Jung had discovered through his years of self-experimentation was nothing less than a new model of human consciousness. The psyche, he now understood, was not simply a personal repository of individual memories and desires. It contained layers of collective memory that connected each person to the accumulated experience of the entire human species. These deeper levels operated according to symbolic rather than rational principles, expressing themselves through the universal patterns he began to call archetypes. The descent into madness that had nearly destroyed him had also provided the key to understanding some of the deepest mysteries of human existence. Jung had mapped territories of consciousness that no previous psychologist had dared to explore. He had encountered the gods and demons that live within every human psyche and had learned to navigate their dangerous but potentially transformative energies. As he began to integrate these insights into a coherent psychological theory, Jung realized that his personal crisis had been preparation for a much larger mission. He would spend the rest of his career developing methods to help others navigate the same treacherous but ultimately healing journey into the depths of their own unconscious minds. The man who had once been dismissed as a delusional mystic was about to emerge as one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. But first, he had to find a way to translate his visionary experiences into language that the rational world could understand and accept. The next phase of Jung's journey would involve nothing less than the creation of an entirely new approach to human psychology, one that honored both scientific rigor and the profound spiritual dimensions of human experience. He would become the architect of analytical psychology, developing concepts and techniques that would influence not only clinical practice, but art, literature, religion, and philosophy for generations to come. The emergence from his psychological underworld was not a dramatic resurrection, but a gradual reassembly of scattered fragments. By 1918, as the guns of the Great War finally fell silent across Europe, Jung found himself slowly returning to what others might recognize as sanity. But he was fundamentally changed. the man who had descended into madness was not the same person who now climbed back toward the light of ordinary consciousness. The first sign of his recovery was his ability to resume clinical practice, though his methods had evolved dramatically from his pre-crisis work. Patients who came to his consulting room in Küsnacht found themselves facing a psychiatrist unlike any they had previously encountered. Jung no longer relied solely on the techniques he had learned at the Burghlzli or borrowed from Freudian analysis. Instead, he had developed an entirely new approach that drew directly from his own harrowing journey through the depths of the psyche. Where other therapists focused on symptoms and pathology, Jung looked for meaning and potential transformation. He had learned firsthand that what appeared to be mental breakdown often represented the psyche's attempt to break through to a new level of consciousness. The chaotic fantasies and disturbing visions that terrified his patients were not merely symptoms to be suppressed, but messages from deeper layers of the self that demanded careful attention and integration. His consulting room itself reflected this transformed perspective. Gone were the sterile medical instruments and clinical charts that had characterized his earlier practice. Instead, the walls were lined with primitive masks, ancient sculptures, and alchemical texts. Jung had begun collecting artifacts from cultures around the world, recognizing in their symbolic content the same archetypal patterns he had encountered in his own visions and in the fantasies of his patients. The therapeutic sessions that took place in this space bore little resemblance to conventional psychiatric treatment. Jung would spend hours listening, not just to what patients said, but to how they said it, attending to the symbolic dimensions of their language and the mythological themes that emerged in their dreams and associations. He taught his patients to engage in active imagination, encouraging them to dialogue with the figures that appeared in their unconscious material rather than simply analysing them from a distance. This approach proved remarkably effective, particularly with patients who had been failed by traditional psychiatric methods. Individuals suffering from what we would now recognise as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and even psychotic episodes began showing dramatic improvements when their symptoms were approached as meaningful communications from the unconscious rather than mere pathological disturbances. Word of Jung's innovative methods spread throughout the international psychological community. Colleagues who had once dismissed him as a mystical charlatan now found themselves forced to take his work seriously. The clinical results were undeniable, even if the theoretical framework remained controversial. Patients who had been considered hopeless cases were returning to productive lives, often with a sense of meaning and purpose that exceeded their pre-illness functioning. But Jung's influence was extending far beyond the narrow confines of psychiatric practice. Artists, writers, and intellectuals from across Europe began making pilgrimages to his home overlooking Lake Zurich, seeking insights that conventional psychology could not provide. They found in Jung someone who understood that creativity and madness were intimately connected, that the same psychological forces that could destroy an individual could also become sources of profound artistic and spiritual insight. Hermann Hesse, the German novelist who would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature, became one of Jung's most devoted followers during this period. Hesse had suffered his own psychological crisis during the war years and found in Jung's approach a way of understanding his suffering that transformed it from meaningless torment into a necessary stage of psychological development. Their relationship would profoundly influence Hesse's later novels, particularly Steppenwolf and The Glass Bead Game, both of which explored Jungian themes of psychological integration and spiritual transformation. The painter Jackson Pollock would later credit Jung's writings with helping him understand the unconscious sources of his artistic inspiration. Pollock's revolutionary drip paintings, which seemed to emerge from some deep psychological wellspring beyond conscious control, embodied the same principle of surrendering to unconscious processes that Jung had discovered during his own descent into madness. Even theologians and religious leaders began to take notice of Jung's work. His insights into the symbolic nature of religious experience offered a way of understanding spiritual phenomena that neither rejected them as mere superstition nor reduced them to pathological symptoms. Jung argued that religious symbols and rituals served essential psychological functions, providing containers for archetypal energies that would otherwise remain chaotic and destructive. This perspective brought him into contact with some of the most advanced spiritual teachers of his era. He engaged in lengthy correspondence with Buddhist monks, Hindu mystics, and Christian contemplatives, exploring the connections between Eastern meditative practices and Western psychological techniques. These exchanges enriched his understanding of consciousness and provided additional validation for his insights into the universal patterns that underlay human experience. As Jung's reputation grew, so did the demands on his time and energy. He found himself traveling extensively, lecturing to packed auditoriums about the new psychology he had discovered in the depths of his own crisis. His audiences included not only medical professionals, but philosophers, anthropologists, historians, and ordinary individuals seeking a deeper understanding of their own psychological struggles. The lectures themselves were performances unlike anything the academic world had previously witnessed. Jung would begin with careful scientific observations, supporting his points with detailed case studies and statistical data. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, he would lead his audience into territories that no conventional psychology had ever explored. He spoke of the collective, unconscious, as if it were a geographical location that could be mapped and navigated. He described archetypes with the precision of a naturalist cataloguing species, yet with the reverence of a priest discussing sacred mysteries. His most influential lecture series took place at the Tavistock Clinic in London in 1935, where he introduced English-speaking audiences to the full scope of his psychological discoveries. The 5 lectures, delivered to standing-room-only crowds, systematically outlined his theory of psychological types, his understanding of the collective unconscious, and his methods for working therapeutically with unconscious material. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Young psychiatrists and psychologists across Britain and America began incorporating Jungian concepts into their own practices. Universities started offering courses in analytical psychology. Publishers competed to translate and distribute Jung's growing body of written work. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a new generation of analysts who had been personally trained by Jung himself. These individuals, who became known as the first generation of Jungian analysts, carried his methods into major cities around the world. They established training institutes, founded professional organizations, and began the systematic development of analytical psychology as a distinct therapeutic approach. Among these early followers was Marie-Louise von Franz, a brilliant young Swiss woman who became one of Jung's closest collaborators. Von Franz possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of fairy tales, myths, and alchemical texts that complemented Jung's own research perfectly. Together, they began the massive project of documenting the archetypal patterns that appeared across different cultures and historical periods. Another crucial figure was Joseph Henderson, an American psychiatrist who brought Jungian concepts to California and helped establish analytical psychology on the West Coast. Henderson's work with creative individuals and his integration of anthropological insights into therapeutic practice demonstrated the versatility and broad applicability of Jung's discoveries. As these disciples spread Jung's teachings around the globe, they also began to develop and refine his original insights. The body of work that became known as analytical psychology grew into a sophisticated therapeutic system with its own training requirements, ethical guidelines, and theoretical refinements. What had begun as one man's desperate attempt to understand his own psychological crisis had evolved into a major force in 20th century psychology. Yet Jung himself remained somewhat ambivalent about the institutionalization of his discoveries. He had learned through bitter experience that psychological truth could not be reduced to dogmatic formulas or rigid techniques. Each individual's journey into the unconscious was unique, requiring approaches that were tailored to their particular psychological constellation and life circumstances. This tension between systematic knowledge and individual uniqueness would become one of the defining characteristics of Jungian psychology. Unlike other therapeutic schools that emphasized standardized procedures and predictable outcomes, analytical psychology insisted on the irreducible mystery of each human being and the need for analysts to remain open to whatever emerged from the depths of their patients' psyches. As the 1930s progressed, Jung found himself increasingly concerned about the political and social developments unfolding across Europe. The rise of fascism and the growing militarization of German society seemed to confirm his darkest insights about the destructive potential of unconscious archetypal forces when they possessed an entire culture. He began to speak and write more urgently about the need for individuals to become conscious of their own psychological depths, before these same forces could manifest collectively in wars, genocides, and other forms of mass destruction. The personal work of psychological integration that he had pioneered was not merely a luxury for troubled individuals, but an urgent necessity for the survival of civilization itself. This conviction would drive the next phase of his career, as Jung turned his attention from individual therapy to the broader questions of how psychology could contribute to solving the collective crises facing humanity. The man who had once been dismissed as a delusional mystic was about to become one of the most prescient social critics of his generation, warning of dangers that few others could even perceive. The shadow of European politics could not be ignored. As Hitler's voice echoed across radio waves and stormtroopers marched through German streets, Jung found himself witnessing the very psychological forces he had encountered in his own descent into madness, now manifesting on a collective scale. The archetypal energies that had once threatened to tear apart his individual psyche were now possessing an entire nation, transforming ordinary citizens into participants in what would become history's most devastating war. From his study overlooking Lake Zurich, Jung watched with growing horror as events unfolded across the border in Germany. The mass rallies, the hypnotic power of Nazi propaganda, the sudden transformation of cultured Europeans into willing participants in brutality and genocide. All of this confirmed his deepest insights about the dangerous potential of unconscious forces when they remained unrecognized and unintegrated. But Jung's response to the rise of fascism was complex and would later prove controversial. Unlike many of his contemporaries who saw Nazism purely in political or economic terms, Jung recognized it as fundamentally a psychological phenomenon. The German people, he argued, had been possessed by archetypal energies that they could neither understand nor control. The ancient Germanic god Wotan, the fierce deity of war and destruction, had awakened from centuries of Christian suppression and was now demanding blood sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. This perspective led Jung to make public statements that would haunt his reputation for decades. He spoke of the psychological differences between Jewish and Aryan mentalities, suggesting that each possessed distinct collective characteristics that needed to be understood and respected. While his intentions may have been scientific rather than political, his words were seized upon by Nazi propagandists and used to justify policies of racial separation and persecution. The controversy deepened when Jung accepted the position of president of the International General Medical Society for Psychotherapy in 1933, after its previous Jewish president was forced to resign under Nazi pressure. Jung claimed he took the role to preserve the organization's international character and protect its Jewish members, but critics argued that his participation legitimized Nazi policies toward mental health professionals. These accusations wounded Jung deeply. He had spent his career developing a psychology that recognized the fundamental unity underlying human diversity. His concept of the collective unconscious suggested that all people shared the same basic psychological structures, regardless of race or nationality. To be accused of supporting racial theories that contradicted his life's work felt like a profound betrayal of everything he had discovered about human nature. The personal cost of these controversies was immense. Many of Jung's Jewish colleagues and former students broke off contact with him entirely. His international reputation suffered severe damage, particularly in the United States, where émigré psychoanalysts spread stories of his alleged Nazi sympathies. For a man who had already endured professional isolation following his break with Freud, this second wave of ostracism was devastating. Yet Jung pressed on with his work, driven by an urgent sense that psychology had a crucial role to play in understanding and preventing the catastrophes unfolding around him. He began developing what would become his theory of synchronicity, the idea that meaningful coincidences reveal hidden connections between psychic and material events. This concept emerged partly from his observations of how individual psychological states seem to mirror larger historical developments. The war years brought personal tragedy as well as professional challenges. In 1944, Jung suffered a severe heart attack that brought him to the edge of death. During his recovery, he experienced a series of visions that were among the most profound of his entire life. He found himself floating in space, looking down at the Earth from a cosmic perspective that revealed the ultimate insignificance of human conflicts in the context of eternal spiritual realities. These near-death experiences convinced Jung that consciousness survived bodily death and that individual existence was part of a much larger cosmic process. He began to speak more openly about his beliefs in the immortality of the soul and the spiritual dimensions of psychological healing. While such statements further distanced him from mainstream scientific psychology, they resonated powerfully with individuals seeking meaning in the aftermath of unprecedented destruction and loss. As the war finally ended in 1945, Jung emerged as one of the few major intellectuals who'd anticipated the catastrophic potential of mass unconsciousness. His warnings about the dangers of psychological projection and collective possession proved prophetic. The Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the wholesale destruction of European civilization. All of these horrors could be understood as manifestations of unconscious forces that humanity had failed to recognize and integrate. The post-war period brought a renaissance of interest in Jung's ideas, particularly among Americans seeking alternatives to the mechanistic psychology that dominated academic institutions. Veterans returning from combat found in analytical psychology a framework for understanding their traumatic experiences that honored both the horror they had witnessed and the potential for healing and transformation. Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming conscious of one's complete psychological nature, offered hope to individuals struggling to rebuild their lives in a world that had lost its moral bearings. Rather than simply adjusting to social norms or suppressing troubling emotions, Jungian analysis encouraged people to embrace the full spectrum of their psychological experience and find their own unique path toward wholeness. The 1950s saw Jung at the height of his international influence. His collected works were being translated into dozens of languages, and analytical institutes were established in major cities around the world. Distinguished visitors made regular pilgrimages to his home in Küsnacht, seeking insights that could help them navigate the psychological complexities of modern life. Among these visitors was the theologian Paul Tillich, who found in Jung's work a bridge between psychology and spirituality that honored both scientific rigor and religious experience. Their conversations explored how psychological healing and spiritual transformation were fundamentally connected processes, each requiring the courage to confront the unknown depths of human existence. The anthropologist Joseph Campbell also became a frequent correspondent, sharing Jung's fascination with the universal patterns that appeared in myths and religious traditions across cultures. Campbell's later work on the hero's journey and the power of myth drew heavily on Jungian insights about the archetypal structures that shape human experience. Even scientists from fields far removed from psychology began to take notice of Jung's ideas. The physicist Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, engaged in lengthy exchanges with Jung about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Their collaboration suggested that the same non-causal connections Jung observed in psychological phenomena might operate at the fundamental levels of physical reality as well. As Jung entered his 70s, he began work on what would become his most ambitious project, a comprehensive exploration of alchemical symbolism and its relationship to psychological transformation. For years, he had been collecting and studying medieval alchemical texts, recognizing in their obscure imagery and cryptic language a systematic map of the individuation process. The alchemists, Jung argued, were not primitive chemists fumbling towards scientific understanding, but sophisticated psychologists who had discovered the same archetypal patterns he had encountered in his own journey into the unconscious. Their quest to transform base metals into gold was actually a symbolic representation of the psychological work required to transform unconscious contents into conscious insight. This research culminated in Mysterium Coniunctionis, a massive work that traced the connections between alchemical symbolism and depth psychology with encyclopedic thoroughness. The book demonstrated Jung's extraordinary erudition and his ability to find meaningful patterns across vastly different domains of human experience. It also revealed the deeply spiritual dimension of his psychological vision, showing how the work of individuation was ultimately a quest for union with the divine ground of existence. By the late 1950s, Jung had become something more than a psychologist or even a scientist. He had evolved into a cultural figure whose ideas influenced art, literature, religion, and philosophy as much as clinical practice. His concepts had entered the popular vocabulary, shaping how ordinary people thought about personality, relationships, and personal growth. Yet Jung himself remained remarkably humble about his achievements. He continued to see himself primarily as an empirical researcher who had stumbled upon psychological territories that demanded further exploration. The theories and techniques that bore his name were not final truths, but provisional maps of regions that each individual would need to navigate according to their own inner compass. As he approached his final years, Jung began to reflect more deeply on the meaning of his life's work and its implications for humanity's future. The atomic age had created unprecedented possibilities for both creation and destruction, and Jung believed that humanity's survival depended on developing a new level of psychological consciousness that could match its technological capabilities. The old gods were dead, but new archetypal forces were emerging that demanded recognition and integration. The challenge facing modern civilization was to find ways of honoring these deep psychological needs without falling into the primitive unconsciousness that had produced 2 world wars and threatened to produce a third, potentially final, catastrophe. This urgent concern for humanity's psychological future would drive Jung's final major contributions to our understanding of consciousness and its role in shaping both individual destiny and collective survival. The man who had begun his career simply trying to understand the strange behaviours of psychiatric patients had become one of the most profound observers of the human condition in all its complexity and mystery. As the 1950s gave way to a new decade, Jung found himself grappling with questions that extended far beyond individual psychology. The world had changed dramatically since his youth in rural Switzerland. Nuclear weapons had made human extinction a genuine possibility. Television was reshaping how people understood reality. Space exploration was challenging humanity's place in the cosmos. Yet beneath these technological marvels, Jung sensed that the fundamental psychological challenges facing humanity remained unchanged. The consulting room in Küsnacht continued to receive a steady stream of visitors, but the nature of their concerns was evolving. No longer were his patients primarily suffering from the classical neuroses that had dominated early 20th century psychiatry. Instead, they came with what Jung began to recognize as a distinctly modern form of psychological distress. They felt disconnected from meaning, alienated from their own deeper nature, trapped in lives that seemed successful on the surface but empty at their core. These were not the dramatic breakdowns that had characterized his earlier cases. These patients functioned perfectly well in society. They held responsible positions, maintained stable relationships, appeared to have everything that modern civilization promised would bring happiness. Yet they experienced a profound sense of emptiness, as if they were living someone else's life rather than their own. Jung recognized in these symptoms something he had first glimpsed during his own psychological crisis decades earlier. Modern consciousness, with its emphasis on rational control and material achievement, had become dangerously disconnected from the deeper sources of vitality and meaning that had sustained human beings throughout history. People were living entirely in what he called the daylight world of ego consciousness, cut off from the regenerative energies of the unconscious. This observation led him to develop what would become one of his most influential concepts, the idea of the modern neurosis as a spiritual crisis rather than a medical condition. The patients who came to him were not sick in any conventional sense. They were suffering from what he termed a loss of soul, a disconnection from the archetypal foundations that give life meaning and direction. Traditional religious institutions, Jung observed, were failing to address this crisis effectively. The symbolic languages that had once connected individuals to transcendent realities had become either literal dogmas that intelligent people could no longer accept or empty rituals that provided comfort but no genuine transformation. Modern men and women found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to create their own relationship with the sacred without the guidance of established traditions. This realization prompted Jung to examine more deeply the psychological functions that religious symbols and practices had served throughout human history. He began to see that what people had interpreted as supernatural phenomena were actually projections of inner psychological realities onto external forms. The gods and demons of ancient mythologies were not primitive superstitions, but sophisticated representations of the archetypal forces that continue to operate within every human psyche. This insight led to his controversial but profound exploration of what he called the religious function of the psyche. Jung argued that human beings possessed an innate need for connection to something greater than their individual ego consciousness. This need was not a weakness or regression, but a fundamental aspect of healthy psychological functioning. When this religious instinct was frustrated or denied, it manifested as neurotic symptoms, depression, anxiety, and the various forms of meaninglessness that characterized modern life. The implications of this perspective were revolutionary. If psychological health required some form of religious experience, then therapy could not simply focus on symptom removal or behavioral adjustment. It had to help individuals discover their own authentic relationship with the transcendent dimensions of existence. The analyst's role became not that of a medical expert treating pathology, but that of a guide helping others navigate their own unique journey toward wholeness. This approach demanded a fundamental revision of therapeutic technique. Jung began encouraging his patients to engage with their symptoms and conflicts not as problems to be solved, but as potential gateways to deeper understanding. A depression might contain the seeds of a necessary spiritual transformation. An anxiety might signal the psyche's attempt to break free from limiting patterns of thought and behavior. A relationship crisis might represent the collision between conscious expectations and unconscious needs for growth and individuation. The active imagination techniques that Jung had developed during his own psychological crisis proved particularly valuable in this work. By learning to dialogue with the figures and scenarios that emerged from their unconscious, patients could access sources of wisdom and guidance that lay beyond the reach of rational analysis. They discovered that their psyches contained not only personal memories and conflicts, but also transpersonal energies that could provide direction and meaning for their lives. One of Jung's most remarkable patients during this period was a successful businessman who had come to analysis suffering from what he described as a crisis of meaning. Despite having achieved everything he had thought he wanted in life, he felt utterly hollow and purposeless. Through months of careful work with his dreams and fantasies, a powerful figure began to emerge in his active imagination sessions. This figure appeared as an ancient craftsman who worked with precious metals and gems, creating objects of extraordinary beauty and significance. Through their conversations, the patient began to understand that his soul was calling him toward a different kind of work, one that honored beauty and craftsmanship rather than mere profit and efficiency. Eventually, he made the radical decision to leave his corporate position and become a jeweler, discovering in this transition not only professional satisfaction, but a profound sense of alignment with his deepest nature. Such dramatic life changes were not uncommon among Jung's patients during this period. The process of individuation often required people to abandon the paths that society had prescribed for them and follow instead the sometimes mysterious guidance of their own unconscious wisdom. This might mean changing careers, ending relationships, moving to new places, or adopting entirely different ways of living. Jung himself embodied this principle of following inner guidance rather than external expectations. As he entered his 70s, he made the surprising decision to undertake what would prove to be one of the most significant projects of his later years: the construction of a stone tower at Bollingen on the shores of Lake Zurich. The tower began as a simple retreat where Jung could escape the demands of his clinical practice and immerse himself in solitary reflection. But as the years passed, it evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. Using his own hands and primitive tools, Jung carved intricate symbolic designs into the stone walls. He created sculptures and inscriptions that seemed to emerge from some deep archetypal source, rather than conscious artistic intention. The tower became a kind of three-dimensional mandala, a sacred space where Jung could connect with the timeless dimensions of his own psyche. Visitors who were invited to see it often reported feeling that they had entered a realm where ordinary time seemed suspended and where the boundaries between past and present became fluid and permeable. Working on the tower provided Jung with direct, experiential confirmation of insights he had been developing about the relationship between creativity and psychological health. The carvings and sculptures seemed to emerge from the same unconscious source that produced his patients' healing dreams and active imagination experiences. The creative process itself became a form of prayer or meditation, a way of accessing wisdom that lay beyond the reach of discursive thought. This period also saw Jung's growing interest in the psychological dimensions of aging and death. As his own mortality became more apparent, he began to explore what he called the second half of life as a distinct developmental phase with its own tasks and challenges. Unlike the first half of life, which was properly focused on establishing oneself in the world through career, relationships, and social achievement. The second half required a fundamental reorientation toward inner development and spiritual preparation. Many of the psychological difficulties that people experienced in midlife and beyond, Jung observed, resulted from trying to continue living according to the values and goals that were appropriate for younger people. The accumulation of external achievements that had once provided satisfaction began to feel empty and meaningless. The competitive drive that had fueled earlier success became a source of anxiety and exhaustion. The social roles that had once defined identity began to feel like prisons rather than expressions of authentic selfhood. The task of the second half of life was to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to bridge the gap between conscious and unconscious, rational and irrational, personal and transpersonal dimensions of existence. This required a kind of psychological courage that was different from the heroic energy of youth, but no less demanding. It meant facing the reality of one's own mortality while simultaneously opening to the possibility that consciousness might continue in some form beyond physical death. Jung's own preparation for death involved a deepening engagement with what he saw as the eternal dimensions of human experience. He spent increasing amounts of time studying the symbols and practices of various mystical traditions, seeking to understand how different cultures had approached the mystery of consciousness and its relationship to ultimate reality. His correspondence during this period reveals a man who had moved far beyond the conventional boundaries of academic psychology. He wrote extensively about synchronicity, the meaningful coincidences that seem to reveal hidden connections between psychic and physical events. He explored the possibility that consciousness might be a fundamental property of the universe rather than merely an emergent product of complex brain activity. He investigated reports of paranormal phenomena, not as a credulous believer, but as a careful observer trying to understand experiences that challenged materialistic assumptions about the nature of reality. These investigations led him to develop what he called his empirical metaphysics, an approach that remained rigorously observational while acknowledging that consciousness might operate according to principles that transcended the mechanical causation assumed by conventional science. Jung insisted that he was not advocating for any particular metaphysical doctrine, but simply trying to account for the full range of psychological phenomena he had encountered during his decades of clinical work. The controversy that surrounded these later developments in Jung's thinking reflected the broader tension between scientific materialism and spiritual inquiry that characterized the intellectual climate of the 1950s. Critics accused him of abandoning scientific rigor in favor of mystical speculation. Supporters argued that he was pioneering a new kind of science that could encompass both objective observation and subjective experience. Jung himself remained remarkably equanimous about these debates. He had learned through long experience that revolutionary ideas always encountered resistance from established ways of thinking. His concern was not with defending his reputation, but with ensuring that the insights he had gained through decades of exploration would be preserved and developed by future generations of researchers and practitioners. As the decade progressed, Jung began to sense that his life's work was approaching completion. The major concepts of analytical psychology had been developed and articulated. Training institutes were established around the world to ensure the continuation of his therapeutic methods. His collected works were being systematically published and translated into multiple languages. The intellectual foundations had been laid for what he hoped would become a new understanding of human consciousness and its potential for development. Yet Jung also recognized that his discoveries were still in their infancy. The territories of the psyche that he had mapped were vast and complex, requiring generations of further exploration to fully understand. The techniques he had developed for working with unconscious material would need to be refined and adapted to meet the changing needs of future patients and clients. Most importantly, the broader cultural implications of his insights had barely begun to be realized. The crisis of meaning that he had identified as the characteristic neurosis of modern life was likely to intensify as technological change accelerated and traditional sources of meaning continued to erode. Humanity would need new ways of connecting with the archetypal foundations of existence if it was to avoid the psychological and spiritual emptiness that threatened to undermine civilization itself. These concerns drove Jung to spend his final active years writing and speaking with unusual urgency about what he saw as the crucial challenges facing humanity in the atomic age. The same psychological forces that could lead to individual neurosis could, when multiplied across entire populations, produce the mass movements and collective delusions that had already brought unprecedented destruction to the world. The solution, Jung believed, lay not in political or social reforms, but in the patient work of individual psychological development. Each person who undertook the difficult journey of individuation, who learned to recognize and integrate the unconscious forces operating within their own psyche, contributed to the collective psychological health of humanity as a whole. This vision of individual transformation as the foundation for collective healing would become one of Jung's most enduring legacies. It offered hope for a species that seemed increasingly capable of destroying itself, while pointing toward practical steps that ordinary individuals could take to contribute to a more conscious and compassionate world. As Jung prepared to enter the final chapter of his extraordinary life, he did so with the knowledge that he had opened doorways to understanding that would continue to be explored long after his death. The man who had once stood at the edge of madness had emerged to offer humanity new ways of navigating the complex relationship between consciousness and the mysterious depths from which it emerged. The twilight years of Carl Gustav Jung's life were marked not by the quiet retreat into comfortable obscurity that might have been expected of a man approaching 80, but by an intensification of his engagement with the deepest questions that had driven him since childhood. As the 1950s drew to a close, Jung found himself in the peculiar position of being both a revered elder whose ideas had transformed modern psychology and a restless explorer still discovering new territories within the vast landscape of human consciousness. The stone tower at Bollingen had become more than a retreat. It was now a kind of laboratory where Jung continued his investigations into what he called the objective psyche. Here, surrounded by the symbols he had carved with his own hands and the natural beauty of Lake Zurich, he pursued questions that had haunted him for decades. What was the relationship between individual consciousness and the larger patterns that seemed to govern both psychic and physical events? How could the insights of depth psychology contribute to humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos? These were not merely theoretical inquiries for Jung. They emerged from direct observations that continued to challenge his understanding of reality itself. Patients would arrive at his consulting room, describing dreams that seemed to anticipate future events with uncanny accuracy. Others would report experiences of profound healing that occurred through encounters with symbolic figures that possessed a reality and autonomy that defied conventional psychological explanation. One particularly striking case involved a middle-aged woman who had been struggling with severe depression following the death of her husband. Despite months of conventional therapy, she remained locked in a state of inconsolable grief that seemed to deepen rather than diminish over time. During an active imagination session, she encountered a luminous figure who identified himself as her deceased husband and engaged her in a lengthy conversation about the nature of love and the continuity of consciousness beyond physical death. The encounter was so vivid and transformative that the woman emerged from the session fundamentally changed. Her depression began to lift, not because she had been convinced of any particular belief about life after death, but because she had experienced directly a sense of ongoing connection with her husband that transcended the boundaries of physical existence. The healing that followed was complete and lasting, leaving Jung to wonder about the nature of the reality she had accessed through her imagination. Such cases forced Jung to confront questions that pushed against the boundaries of what psychology as a science was prepared to acknowledge. Were these experiences simply the products of unconscious wish fulfillment, or did they represent genuine contact with dimensions of reality that lay beyond the reach of ordinary consciousness? Jung's scientific training demanded skeptical rigor, yet his clinical observations suggested that consciousness might operate according to principles that mechanistic psychology could not account for. This tension led him to develop what became known as his synchronicity principle, the idea that meaningful coincidences revealed an underlying order in the universe that connected psychic and physical events through non-causal relationships. The concept emerged from his collaboration with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, whose own investigations into quantum mechanics had revealed similar acausal connections at the fundamental levels of physical reality. Their exchanges, conducted over many years through letters and personal meetings, explored the possibility that consciousness and matter were dual aspects of a single underlying reality that operated according to principles of meaning rather than mere mechanical causation. Just as quantum particles seem to exhibit mysterious connections that defied classical physics, psychological events appeared to participate in patterns of significance that transcended the linear chains of cause and effect assumed by conventional science. Jung's exploration of these ideas culminated in his essay, Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, published in 1952 as part of a collaboration with Pauli. The work represented one of the most ambitious attempts ever made to bridge the gap between scientific observation and the recognition of meaning as a fundamental organizing principle in the universe. The essay drew on examples from Jung's clinical practice, his studies of Chinese philosophy, and his observations of phenomena that seemed to cluster around moments of psychological transformation. Patients would often report that significant dreams were accompanied by unusual external events that seemed to mirror or amplify their inner experiences. A woman dreaming of a golden scarab beetle would discover an actual scarab tapping at her window during the analytical session. A man struggling with a crucial life decision would encounter a series of seemingly random events that all pointed toward the same choice. These synchronicities, Jung argued, were not mere coincidences but manifestations of what he called the unus mundus, the unified world that underlies the apparent separation between inner and outer, subjective and objective, psychological and physical reality. At moments of heightened consciousness, particularly during periods of psychological transformation, the barriers between these different dimensions of experience became permeable, allowing meaning to manifest through the coordination of psychic and material events. The implications of this perspective extended far beyond psychology into questions of cosmology and metaphysics that had traditionally been the province of philosophy and religion. If consciousness was not merely a byproduct of brain activity, but a fundamental aspect of reality itself, then the relationship between human beings and the universe needed to be reconceptualized entirely. Jung began to envision consciousness as a cosmic principle that manifested differently at various levels of complexity, from the simple responsiveness of elementary particles to the sophisticated self-awareness of human beings. This view suggested that the individuation process was not merely a personal psychological development, but participation in the universe's own evolution toward greater consciousness and meaning. These ideas found expression in his later writings on alchemy, which he saw as a sophisticated symbolic system for describing the transformation of consciousness. The medieval alchemists, Jung argued, had discovered through their laboratory work and meditative practices the same archetypal patterns that govern psychological development. Their quest to transform base metals into gold was a symbolic representation of the process by which unconscious contents could be refined into conscious wisdom. The alchemical texts that Jung studied with such devotion during his later years provided him with a language for describing psychological transformations that went beyond the clinical terminology of conventional psychiatry. The operations described by the alchemists, dissolution, coagulation, distillation, conjunction, corresponded to specific phases of the individuation process that Jung had observed in his patients and experienced in his own psychological development. This research culminated in his massive work Mysterium Coniunctionis, a comprehensive exploration of alchemical symbolism that represented the summation of decades of investigation into the deepest patterns of psychological transformation. The book demonstrated Jung's extraordinary erudition and his ability to discern meaningful connections across vastly different domains of human experience. But the work also revealed something else: Jung's growing conviction that the insights of depth psychology pointed toward a fundamental unity underlying all existence. The same archetypal patterns that shaped individual psychological development also governed the evolution of cultures, the transformation of historical epochs, and the very structure of cosmic reality itself. This vision of universal interconnectedness became increasingly central to Jung's thinking during his final years. He began to see his life's work not merely as a contribution to the understanding of mental illness or even psychological health, but as part of humanity's larger quest to understand its place in a meaningful cosmos. The urgency of this quest was heightened by his observations of the cultural and political developments of the late 1950s. The Cold War had created a global situation of unprecedented danger, with nuclear weapons capable of destroying civilization held in check only by the psychological stability of political leaders. The same unconscious forces that Jung had studied in individual patients now operated on a planetary scale, threatening consequences that could eliminate the human species entirely. Yet Jung also saw signs of hope in the growing interest in Eastern philosophy, depth psychology, and other approaches to consciousness that recognized the importance of inner development. A new generation of seekers was emerging, individuals who understood that technological progress without corresponding psychological evolution was ultimately self-destructive. These younger people found in Jung's work a framework for understanding their own quest for meaning and authenticity. His concepts of individuation, the collective unconscious, and archetypal psychology provided tools for navigating the complex psychological challenges of modern life, without losing connection to the deeper sources of wisdom and vitality. Among these seekers were artists, writers, and musicians who used Jungian insights to explore new forms of creative expression. The beat poets, abstract expressionist painters, and experimental composers of the 1950s drew inspiration from Jung's understanding of the creative process as a dialogue between conscious intention and unconscious spontaneity. Even scientists in fields far removed from psychology began to find value in Jung's ideas about the relationship between consciousness and reality. Biologists studying the emergence of complex systems, anthropologists investigating the universal patterns in human cultures, and physicists exploring the fundamental nature of matter all discovered resonances with Jungian concepts in their own research. This cross-disciplinary influence reflected Jung's conviction that the insights of analytical psychology had implications that extended far beyond clinical practice. He had always insisted that psychology was not merely a medical specialty, but a fundamental science of human nature with relevance for every domain of human activity. As Jung entered his 80s, he began to reflect more deeply on the legacy of his life's work and its potential impact on humanity's future development. The concepts he had developed, individuation, the collective unconscious, archetypal psychology, synchronicity, were no longer the property of a small circle of analysts and patients. They had entered the broader cultural conversation, influencing how people thought about personality, relationships, creativity, and spiritual development. Yet Jung also recognized that his discoveries were still in their early stages of development. The territories of consciousness that he had mapped were vast and complex, requiring generations of further exploration to fully understand. The techniques he had pioneered for working with unconscious material would need to be refined and adapted to meet the changing needs of future generations. Most importantly, the broader implications of his insights for human culture and civilization had barely begun to be realized. The crisis of meaning that he had identified as the characteristic malady of modern life was likely to intensify as traditional sources of purpose and direction continued to erode in the face of rapid technological and social change. The solution, Jung believed, lay not in returning to outdated forms of religious or cultural authority, but in developing new ways of accessing the archetypal foundations of human experience. Each individual who undertook the challenging work of psychological development, who learned to recognize and integrate the unconscious forces operating within their own psyche, contributed to the collective wisdom and maturity of the human species. This vision of individual transformation as the foundation for collective evolution became one of Jung's most enduring contributions to human understanding. It offered a path forward for a species that had acquired unprecedented power over its environment but had not yet developed the psychological wisdom necessary to use that power responsibly. As Jung prepared for the final phase of his extraordinary journey, he did so with the knowledge that he had opened doorways to understanding that would continue to be explored long after his death. The questions he had raised about the nature of consciousness, the reality of meaning, and the possibility of psychological transformation would challenge and inspire future generations of researchers, practitioners, and seekers. The boy who had once listened to his mother's conversations with invisible spirits had grown into a man whose investigations of the human psyche had revealed depths and possibilities that few had imagined. His legacy would not be a finished system of knowledge, but an ongoing invitation to explore the mysterious relationship between consciousness and the cosmos, between individual development and collective evolution, between the personal quest for meaning and humanity's larger destiny among the stars. In the summer of 1961, as Jung approached his 86th birthday, the weight of mortality pressed upon him with increasing urgency. The tower at Bollingen, which had served as his sanctuary for decades, now felt like a place of preparation. Each stone he had carved, each symbol he had etched into the walls, seemed to pulse with significance as he contemplated the approaching threshold between life and whatever lay beyond. His daily routines had simplified to their essential elements. Morning walks along the lakeshore, where he would pause to examine the patterns of light on water or the shapes of clouds gathering over distant mountains. Long afternoons in his study, surrounded by the manuscripts and journals that contained a lifetime of psychological discoveries. Evening conversations with visitors who continued to seek his wisdom, though their numbers had dwindled as his energy waned. The visitors who did come during these final months found a man transformed by his proximity to death. The intellectual intensity that had characterized his middle years had given way to a profound serenity, as if he had finally made peace with the mysteries that had tormented him since childhood. He spoke less about theories and concepts, more about the direct experience of consciousness in its encounter with the infinite. One such visitor was a young psychiatrist from America who had traveled to Switzerland specifically to meet the aging master. The conversation that ensued would later be remembered as one of Jung's most profound reflections on the nature of his life's work and its ultimate meaning. When asked about his greatest discovery, Jung paused for a long moment before responding that he had learned consciousness was far vaster and more mysterious than anyone had imagined. The human psyche, he said, was not contained within the skull but extended into dimensions that science was only beginning to glimpse. This recognition had come at great personal cost. Jung acknowledged that his journey into the depths of consciousness had isolated him from many conventional relationships and comfortable certainties. He had been forced to live with questions that had no easy answers, to embrace paradoxes that rational thinking could not resolve. Yet he expressed no regret about the path he had chosen, insisting that the truth he had discovered about human nature was worth any sacrifice. On June 6, 1961, Carl Gustav Jung died peacefully in his home overlooking Lake Zurich. The same waters that had witnessed his birth into a world of supernatural mysteries 8 decades earlier. His final words spoken to his housekeeper were characteristically enigmatic. "Let's have a really good red wine tonight." Even in death, he maintained the capacity for surprise that had defined his entire extraordinary life. The man who had begun as a troubled child, listening to his mother's conversations with spirits, had become one of the most revolutionary thinkers in human history. From the sterile corridors of the Burghlzli to the mystical depths of his own psyche, from his collaboration and bitter break with Freud to his final insights into the cosmic dimensions of consciousness, Jung had mapped territories of the human soul that few had dared to explore. His legacy extends far beyond the consulting room. Every time we speak of introverts and extroverts, every moment we recognize the deeper patterns that connect all human experience. Every instance when we find meaning in apparent coincidence, we are drawing upon insights that Jung wrested from the very depths of madness and mystery. Perhaps most importantly, Jung showed us that the journey into the unconscious is not a luxury for the troubled few, but an urgent necessity for humanity's survival. In an age when our technological power far exceeds our psychological wisdom, his message remains more relevant than ever. The same forces that can destroy us individually can also transform us collectively if we have the courage to face them consciously. The questions Jung raised about consciousness, meaning, and human transformation remain as compelling today as they were a century ago. What lies beneath the surface of our ordinary awareness? How can we navigate the dangerous but transformative depths of our own psyches? How can individual healing contribute to collective wisdom? These questions ensure that Jung's influence will continue to ripple through human culture for generations to come. The old man who carved symbols into stone has left us something far more enduring than monuments. He has given us new ways of understanding what it means to be human in a universe that is stranger, more meaningful, and more mysterious than we ever dared to imagine.